they're starting to realize, common law is actually a better way for business. So Dubai is like, we have to adopt British, common law and the free market when it comes to the finances. And voila, in less than a generation, Dubai completely unrecognizable.
Dubai underwent 45 years of vigorous development via government actively intervening in the economy prior to switching over to common law. 45 years. Hey guys, this is part 2 of a video debunking Magatte Wade on laissez, faire capitalism. Here's part 1, where I thoroughly debunk her claims that Singapore, China, and Rwanda developed or are developing via laissez, faire capitalism. In this part, I'm going to debunk her claims regarding how Dubai developed. Here's what she says.
Dubai just recently entered the top 10 of international financial centers of the world. And what Dubai did at some point is think about it and be like, on this bare, plot of sand that's technically worth nothing right now as is, this 110 acres of land, sand everywhere. They're like, well, maybe Sharia law is not the best for business. We got to think about better set of laws for business. We're talking only about business, not family law, not anything else but business. And they decided there's got to be something better. And so they looked around, and that's actually when, to take one of the terms you used earlier, they're starting to realize, common law is actually a better way for business, specifically British common law. So Dubai is like, we have to adopt British, common law, primarily British common law. We're going to hire retired British common law judges to come and educate the law here, train our own people. And that, along with many other reforms, to also become a top center when it comes to the, and in the free market when it comes to the finances. Dubai...
Yeah, well, that British common law system, so it's very, very interesting. And it's bottom up, not top down.
It's totally
and
that.
English common law is a gift from God, man.
No,
it's something else.
Absolutely. And that's the key word there when you said bottom up. So common law is so much better for bottom up approaches. And we all know that markets work better in a bottom up approach. And also, when they have to educate the law and resolve a dispute, they're going to be much more respectful to the contract that was passed between the two parties than, say, civil law would be. Right? And so anyway, so from this standpoint here, you have Dubai who is now trying to put all of this together, and eventually they put a set of laws together that would now be conducive to being a top international financial center in the world. And voila, in less than a generation, in less than 25 years, Dubai completely unrecognizable.
Okay, so Dubai's development, she pretty much chalks up to them switching to British common law. She does add that there were a bunch of other reforms they made, but since she doesn't mention any of them even offhand, how important could they be to her argument? What she does say is they instituted British common law, and then within 25 years, they were, voila, super duper developed. Now, I'm going to get into common law, but first let me point out some of the missing context from her description of the situation. Firstly, Dubai is a state that's part of a nation called the United Arab Emirates. When the states that now form the UAE got their independence from Britain, they'd already found oil about a decade earlier. The Sheikh, or the leader, of Abu Dhabi, which is Dubai's next-door neighbor and the UAE's largest economy and geographic territory by far, he had already been proactively investing in development and had been seeing returns on it. By returns, I don't mean profits at that point in time. I mean that Abu Dhabi was successfully building a foundation of infrastructure, hospitals, schools, industry, etc. In 1971, when all those states came together, they elected Sheikh Zayed as the president of the UAE. He continued his policies of active government intervention in the economy for the entire nation. He created a plethora of government bureaus to address various development needs of the country, very similar to what FDR did in the US in the early 1930s. It was the complete and utter opposite of the government standing back and letting the markets do their thing, as Magatte asserts. In fact, Zayed's brother, Sheikh, had been standing back and not investing new oil revenues in the development of Abu Dhabi, which is the very reason why the nobility of Abu Dhabi deposed him and selected Zayed as its new sheikh in 1966. He was literally selected as leader because he was seen as more willing to spend on development projects than his brother. So like I said, Zayed created a plethora of government departments to address various development needs in the country. And in 1976, he created the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, which is now the world's third largest sovereign investment fund, worth $1 trillion. Now, it's important to understand that a government taking an active interventionist role in its economy does not necessarily mean that all funds for something like the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, or for a central bank, or for various development projects come directly from the government. It simply means that they organize it and invest a certain amount, but they also invite outside investment in the form of bonds and stock shares. But the active government involvement needs to be there in order to create it and to steer it in the direction of real concrete development for the nation. But regardless of all that, Zayed was known for investing a lot of Abu Dhabi's oil revenues into the development of Abu Dhabi and the UAE. Abu Dhabi's economy, by the way, comprises 2/3 of the economy of the UAE, and the city of Abu Dhabi is the nation's capital, seat of government. Now, not only was Zayed investing in things like infrastructure and industry, he was also investing in healthcare, schools, and human needs. And while I'm not a huge advocate of undeveloped countries spending a lot on social services, it still goes to show that the UAE is such a case where major material development took place alongside spending on social service sectors, as it did in Singapore and as it is in Rwanda currently, which I talked about in part 1 of this video. Here's a quote from Zayed that illustrates this point. "We use wealth to serve our people, to build schools, hospitals, roads, farms, and factories." And by we, he means the government. Thus, the government has always been active in building all of those sorts of things for the society. And by the way, land grants were given out to, if not all citizens, to a considerably large proportion of them. And they were granted for free. Those families with higher status at the time, they did get much larger swaths of land, but citizens of all societal backgrounds were given land. Everyone was also given free access to healthcare and education. Zayed also founded the Abu Dhabi Fund for Arab Economic Development. This was in 1971 at the outset of independence from Britain. It was a fund that gave money from Abu Dhabi oil revenues to poorer Arab countries in Asia and Africa. Zayed is known as a very generous and benevolent leader in the Middle East, and also fairly liberal compared to the leaders of other Gulf states. If you're like me, you probably always thought that the reason Dubai and the UAE have more liberal social laws than conservative neighbor Saudi Arabia is that they wanted to accommodate the foreigners working there for international companies. But the reality is, Zayed himself had a more socially liberal outlook than the Saudi royal family and truly desired happiness for his people. But back in 1968, it was Zayed and the Sheikh of Dubai who met and agreed to form into the UAE Federation. That Sheikh was Sheikh Rashid, and he was already extremely development-oriented himself, embarking on development projects as far back as 1961, even before oil was found in Dubai. He was inspired by what he'd seen in Europe and wanted to bring that to Dubai. So just like Zayed, he began development projects such as expanding the port, constructing a large airport, improving roads and public transportation, and he was extremely ambitious with these projects to the point that people thought he was wildly overspending. Reminds me a lot of DeWitt's Ditch, which is what people were calling the Erie Canal when Governor DeWitt Clinton of New York began digging it in 1817. But just like it did for Sheikh Rashid, The Erie Canal was successful beyond everyone's imagination and made New York State and New York City into the heart of U.S. commerce that it is today. You can check out my video, How the U.S. Developed, for more info on that. In any case, Rashid began construction of the largest port in the world in 1972. This is just after the formation of the UAE. So how much you want to bet UAE President Zayed was key to helping Rashid getting the funding for this immense port project. Now you see why I just spent so much time on the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi, because it's important to really comprehend what kind of person the president of the UAE was at the time that the Sheikh of Dubai began construction of the super mega infrastructure project that provided Dubai with its wealth outside of oil revenues for decades to come. The port project was finished in 1979. Like I said, eerily reminiscent of the Erie Canal, which also took exactly 7 years to construct. Rashid died in 1981, and his son Sheikh Mohammed took the reins. Mohammed continued vigorously investing in development projects. In fact, he was known as a bit of a micromanager. He was constantly going around visiting construction sites of these projects. So again, completely the opposite of government just standing back and letting laissez faire economics do its own thing. Now, with the largest port in the world already having been constructed by his father, Sheikh Mohammed did create an economic free zone within the port to invite in wealth and business from abroad. By free zone, I imagine it means that there were no income taxes or major corporate taxes within this zone. He created it in 1985, but still no switch over to common law in Dubai at that time. Common law, in fact, wouldn't come into play until 2006. Until that time, Mohammed was still busy actively intervening the economy, micromanaging at construction sites, and investing oil revenues in the development of Dubai. And if you want to see an actual film clip of Sheikh Zayed, not Sheikh Mohammed, but Sheikh Zayed, literally micromanaging a real estate construction project, click the link that just appeared in the top right corner of this screen. So Dubai underwent 45 years of vigorous development via government actively intervening in the economy prior to switching over to common law. Let me repeat that. 45 years. So this lady's characterization of Dubai as just a strip of sand at the time they instituted common law is frankly just a lie. So that's pretty much case closed, obviously. And while it's not nice to add insult to injury, I'll make an exception for an agent of the Atlas network, which is what Magatte is. So let's take a slightly closer look at common law. First, let's take a look at this map which denotes the types of legal systems used by each country. Common law is pink, civil law is blue, customary law is yellow. And there are color codes for mixed systems as well. Right off the bat, you see a lot of countries who use civil law. In Asia, you see China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. All the developed East Asian countries use civil law, aside from Singapore and Hong Kong, who, yeah, they do use forms of common law, but that's because they were both British colonies up until fairly recently. Pakistan and Bangladesh, also former British colonies, also use common law. But would you consider Pakistan or Bangladesh developed? Then we look over here, France, Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, Norway, also all using civil law. So obviously, if we've got the majority of developed nations not using common law, then common law can't be the common denominator for development. And in fact, England itself didn't develop due to British common law. It adopted common law in 1066, but it wasn't until 500 years later that England and Great Britain, or the British Isles, became a dominant force in the world. I believe it was 1588, which historians note as the date when Britain proved itself as a major naval player because it repulsed a naval attack from a huge Vatican-backed Spanish armada 500 years after England adopted common law, but only 70 years after Luther initiated the Protestant Reformation, and only 50 years after England officially adopted Protestantism. This book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, explains how the spread of Protestantism in Northwest Europe spurned the onset of the industrial era and what we now call development. And don't quote me on it, but according to a sociology professor I know, this book is part of the general curriculum in most university sociology departments worldwide. So in much of academia, it's pretty well agreed upon that the Reformation developed England, not common law. Which do you think did? The one that happened 50 years prior to England's development, or the one that happened 500 years prior? Pretty obvious. Now, something important to understand about common law is that it's the legal system of the state of New York. And it's pretty common for two international corporations signing a commercial deal, i.e., two corporations who aren't necessarily US based, to denote that the contract will abide by New York state law, which is common law. They do that because New York is the main financial center of the world and has piled up a long history of commercial dispute cases in its court's archives. The thing is, sometimes there are situations that fall into a confusing gray area between two stated laws in the books, which makes it difficult for a judge to know how to rule on said situation. But by looking at the archives of past similar rulings on commercial cases in the state of New York, which has the largest volume of commercial cases in the world, the judge will have something to go off of. So if there's ever a dispute between the two corporations down the line, they can more easily settle it in New York state courts than in the courts of their home countries, simply because the financial center of the world has a ton of past examples to go off of in commercial litigations. And this concept of ruling based off past precedents from similar cases is essentially what common law is. If you've ever watched a movie that involves courtroom scenes and the lawyer says something like, "Your Honor, in Dalrymple versus the state of Virginia, blah, blah, blah," or something like that, that is common law. The lawyer's citing a past case as precedence, and you see it in Hollywood movies because the US uses the common law system. In the early 2000s, when Dubai and Abu Dhabi also did this, she doesn't mention that, when they both set up common law courts for commercial cases, they didn't switch everything to common law. It was specifically for commercial cases. They were also in the midst of making reforms to try to become essentially the third most important financial center in the world, behind New York and London. They even set up a special financial zone, very similar to how the City of London is a special zone within Greater London, so that the financial zone has its own set of laws, which aren't beholden to the laws of the rest of Dubai or to the rest of the UAE. And in fact, as a side note, if you watch the documentary called The Spider's Web, you'll see that the City of London and its exemption from the rules of Greater London and of Great Britain are what allows it to take in so much corrupt money from corrupt government leaders and corporations throughout the world. But I digress. Look, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a legal historian, but just by doing the basic research, it seems pretty obvious that Dubai instituted British common law so that they could simply replicate the legal system to which the vast majority of major international commercial contracts are adhered. I hope you all understand that last point because it's important. It has nothing to do with development. Dubai was already a first world country in 2006 when it instituted common law. And just a side note that People throw memes of before and after photos of Dubai up on social media all the time, which is a bad way to judge its development. Firstly, because they don't show all parts of town, but more importantly, because there are only 300,000 actual Dubaians living in Dubai. All the skyscrapers you see in Dubai are for housing the 2,700,000 foreigners living there. If you think of a city of 300,000 people in the US or in other developed countries like Germany, would you really expect it to have a towering, luxurious skyline? Truth is, back in the early 1990s and even in the 1980s, prior to the real estate building boom, most Dubaians already lived first world level lives. Their own house in a villa in the suburbs, 2 cars, color TVs, comfortable couches, if they use couches, I don't know, but comfortable furniture, eating out, etc. Instituting common law was a step Dubai took after it was already developed, in order to comply with international standards for operating as a major financial and banking center in the world. So that advocating that third world countries in Africa switch their commercial court systems over to British common law in order to develop, based off the case of Dubai, is totally absurd. And honestly, it's an insane conclusion for it to have come to. And all of Jordan Peterson's bumblings about British common law being the natural law of man and that it being based off of theological and constitutional principles, make it a bottom-up system, are just that. They're bumblings. They're nothing more.
That British common law system, so it's very, very interesting theologically and metaphysically. So it's predicated on the idea that every individual has all the rights that there are, except for those that are specifically regulated and limited by legal necessity. And then generally that realm of necessity has emerged only as a consequence of disputes between people. So you're free to do whatever you want unless you have a dispute with someone else. Then the dispute is adjudicated according essentially to constitutional and theological principles, and then a precedent is established. And then the whole body of law built up that body of precedents.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's bottom up, not top down.
It's totally
And
that.
English common law is a gift from God, man.
No,
It's something else.
Absolutely. And
Magatte had already mentioned that Dubai doesn't use common law for its civil and criminal cases, only in commercial cases. So Jordan's philosophical ramblings there are even more nonsensical with that in mind. So now, obviously, we see that British common law is not a common denominator for undeveloped countries developing. And if you watch part 1 of this video, you'll see that laissez faire economics is also not a common denominator for undeveloped countries developing. So the nations of Africa should look to neither of those systems in their quest for development. What is a common denominator for undeveloped countries developing? Active interventionist economics. The government actively intervening in the economy and actively initiating development projects. This was the case for the development of Singapore and China, as we saw in part 1. If you haven't already watched that, go check it out. It was the case for Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and the UAE. It was the case for England and the Netherlands in the 1600s, and for the US in the 1800s. It was the case for Napoleonic and Bourbon France, the same for Germany, which developed under Bismarck, the same for Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. It literally is the common denominator in undeveloped countries developing. Case closed. Check out part 1 if you haven't already. And please subscribe and like, guys. I'm at all of 120 subscriptions right now to my YouTube channel. So if you can help me out, and maybe if you could send my videos to friends who might be interested in them. And, once I can do this full time, my output volume will really pick up speed and my content will get better and better. So if you want to see that happen, appreciate it if you help me out. See y'all next time. Take care.